Welcome to the Adventure to Evolve podcast, your conscious playground. Here, we explore leadership strategies to lead the most incredible adventure of your lifetime, your story. I'm Shalia Stafford, your host and ex-corporate sales leader turned podcast host, keynote speaker, and entrepreneur. Using leadership strategies, I'm guiding you to lead all the awkward, uncomfortable, heart-beating, palm sweating experiences that serve your growth and make your 80-year-old self proud without the corporate jargon. In this chapter of your life, what experiences are calling you to explore every layer of who you are? If that is your truth, I triple dog dare you to dive in, guided by the wisdom of your divine essence. If you like what you hear and want to go deeper into your adventure, join our online course at goflipthescript.com. Welcome back, everyone. It's Shalia here. You have arrived to your cozy corner of the internet where we sift through the adventure to evolve while we get to create our authentic stories. But leading this experience isn't always the easiest, because if it was, we would all have the ability to go confidently into every direction that aligns with the most authentic aspect of our soul. Every opportunity, even the challenges where we're questioning ourselves or we're having failures, fear, doubt, and uncertainty, are opportunities for us to uncover more aspects that help us deepen our relationship with this adventure. And here to help us explore the topic of imposter syndrome is Chris. Chris is a professional speaker, a certified leadership coach, and a two-time entrepreneur and a mentor to leaders all around the world. He's the author of Overcoming the Imposter, Silence Your Inner Critic, and Lead with Confidence. I am excited to have him help us explore the idea of imposter syndrome. Most of us may have some sort of experience with it, whether it's when we are consciously and finitely attuned to what that feels like when we're not wanting to take on an experience that helps us deepen our growth and puts us in alignment with where we're going. Or sometimes life has a funny way of tricking us and not allowing us to see the moments where we're experiencing imposter syndrome, but it shows up in distracting our actions towards the behaviors that help us create what we truly want in life. So Chris, thank you so much for being here today. I'm so excited to explore this adventure with you and really dig into the experience of imposter syndrome and what it looks like to be a human in that arena.
You're welcome. And thank you so much for having me on. I'm looking forward to this conversation a lot.
Yes, me too. Chris, as a tradition of the show, we like to play a few fire weight questions to get to know you a little bit better. But what I want to do first is explore a question that helps us understand what you do in life, what you value in life. So if you and I were to bump into each other in the aisles of the supermarket of life, what would I find in your shopping cart that tells me more about what you do?
What would you find in my shopping cart? Well, if we're in a supermarket, you're probably going to find some healthy snacks, maybe some raw nuts and some fruity stuff, and then maybe something a little bit on the sweet side because I have a light bit of a sweet tooth. In terms of metaphorically, if you're asking about, what would relate to the kind of work that I do, I think you would probably find some books and some kind of learning material, something that I'm in the process of learning myself so that I can teach it to others. Because I do a lot of that, of consuming of books and resources and just learning things that I see my clients going through so that I can then be a resource to them.
What is it that you're curious about?
What am I curious about? I'm really starting to learn about community building. I have been a coach and a consultant, and I've done a lot of one-on-one work, but I've sort of hit a capacity of what I can do individually helping people. And so what I'm now starting to focus on is how do I become a connector, where certainly I'm bringing some expertise and there's a common conversation happening around something like a book that I've written or a course that I've developed. But how do I add value to people by getting them talking to one another? And so that's a little bit different dynamic than what I've done in the past. And I've been digging into that idea and what is successful, what kind of models are working in connecting people and building community.
What is something that you will never do?
I try not to say never, but something that I rarely do is run. I hate running.
Me
And
too.
I often tell people, if you see me running, you better run too. Something bad is going down. So I will probably never run a marathon. I will probably never be a long distance runner because I just don't enjoy it. And I get regular exercise in lots of other ways. But yeah, I'm probably not ever going to run a long race.
I have a 15-year-old who does track, and I question him all the time. I was like, you're really enjoying this.
Yeah.
What is something that you understand about your life today that you didn't understand a year ago?
Okay. A year ago. That's going to be interesting. I think that in the last year, I have become more aware of my ability to increase my capacity. And what I mean by that is, I've had several conversations recently where I describe for someone the kind of work that I do. And I'm a professional speaker. I'm an executive and leadership coach. I do some consulting work. I'm on faculty at a coaching school where I teach and train other coaches. I'm developing an online course. I've written a book. I've, got some other projects going on. I'm also on several nonprofit boards. I do a lot of things. And when I describe that to people, sometimes I get this look like, oh my goodness, how do you manage it all? And I started to reflect back on that and say, how do I do all these things? And I realized not too long ago that what I've done is I've layered one thing on top of the other. I didn't take all of that on at once. I didn't try to do all of those things initially, but I've gotten good at something and gotten to where it's somewhat automatic, it's streamlined, it's efficient, and then I add something to it, and then I take on something new. And what's happened is, as I've done all of those things for many years, my capacity to sort of wrap my head around them all and keep them all wrangled and keep my schedule straight and manage all the complexity of that has increased, just like building a muscle or developing a skill. And so now that sort of makes me think, well, what else is possible? How much capacity can I actually gain if I really wanted to and if I really work at it? So I've just sort of recently become aware of the flexibility or the ability to grow your capacity and started to think about, what does that make possible?
I complete this stop. I wish I had paid more attention when.
I wish I had paid more attention when I was younger and I got to listen to really smart and influential people that I didn't appreciate or recognize. I remember years ago, I was a software developer and I was at a big software conference and I heard this guy tell a story about business and what made business successful. And it kind of stuck with me. It was an interesting story and I remember hearing it. And it wasn't until more than a decade later that I read the book Good to Great by Jim Collins. And I saw that story and I realized I heard Jim Collins talk at a conference and I had no idea what a incredible mind and how much experience he had and all the wisdom that was there. I just sort of took it for granted. And so I guess I wish I recognized some of those thought leaders that I had access to early in my career. And I wished I read more of the books that those people wrote earlier in my career.
If your 109-year-old self were to get into a time travel capsule to go back in time and come here today to this very moment, what advice would they give you?
You know what? I'm going to pause and say I love this question because so often we talk about, if I could go back now to my 15-year-old self or my 20-year-old self, what would I say? And I love the idea of what would my future self tell me? And I think that my 109-year-old self, who, boy, that's like 60 something years older than I am now, I think he would say, take more risks. I think he would say, don't worry quite as much about the potential negative consequences of experimenting or trying something. Think about the possibilities and think about what you could learn, even if it doesn't go well.
I'm curious, if you were to break up your life up until this point into 3 chapters and give each chapter a name, what would you name each of your 3 chapters?
What would I name the chapters? Oh man, this is a tough one. So the first chapter, would be my childhood and upbringing, and it probably would be called something along the lines of I know everything, because that's what I thought.
Yes.
By about age, 21, 22, I thought I had it all figured out and nobody could tell me anything. I was kind of an arrogant little young man. And then the second chapter, would be that the period where I started working and earning a living. I started, sort of adulting for real and figuring out how hard life can be. And that chapter would probably be something more like, I think I know a few things, and I've got some stuff down, but I'm learning a few things along the way as well. And then the third chapter would probably be the last few years, where I have transitioned into coaching other leaders and really, have been given the title, if you will, of thought leader as I've published a book and as I'm professionally speaking and things like that. And I think that the title of this chapter would be, I know so much less than everybody thinks I do. Because the more I learn and
Yes.
the more I grow, the more I realize how little I actually know. And that even the little nuggets of wisdom that I have to offer to the world are just tiny and little bits of help in the grand scheme of things. And I'm far from having it all figured out. And I'm still learning from so many other people, and still have a lot to learn and experience. So I think some of that obviously is just maturity. You come to recognize
Yes.
and you develop some humility, hopefully, as you get older and more mature. But it's really a recognition that, I thought I had it all figured out, and I know a lot more than I did then. And yet I'm also so much more aware today of how little I actually know.
Yes. It's interesting because even in the way that imposter syndrome may work, it's like when we are on the brink of success, starting to feel at the height of whatever it is we're accomplishing and going towards, that little sneaky voice comes inside of our head and starts whispering,
Yeah.
perhaps you don't deserve this. You're not ready enough. You're not confident enough. People are going to understand that. Maybe you don't understand what you don't know. And that's not normal. I'm curious, as we segue into the topic of the work that you have really dedicated your career to at this chapter in your life, how do you experience imposter syndrome? What is imposter syndrome? And how can we identify ways in which it shows up in our lives?
Yeah. Well, so just to define it really briefly, imposter
Yeah.
syndrome it's a psychological term that was coined in the 1970s, actually. So though it's just starting to get a lot of traction here recently, it's not a brand new idea or term, but it refers to the tendency of many people, it turns out, to undervalue their success and their accomplishments, and in a sense, overvalue the success of others. And so what happens is, I look at another entrepreneur or maybe another author, another speaker, and say, well, they're successful because they're smart and they're savvy and they seem to have a plan and execute it really well. They know what they're doing and they make all the right moves. Whereas my success has involved some elements of luck and good timing and maybe just some connections or relationships. I got a lot of help along the way. And boy, I sure know that I've made a lot of mistakes and there've been a lot of cracks and flaws in my plan. And somehow I've just managed to muddle my way through it. And the underlying fear is that sooner or later, someone or everyone is going to figure out that I really don't know what I'm doing, that I'm just making it up as I go. And that if that happens, I'm going to be exposed as a fraud. And then it's all going to come crumbling down around me. And it turns out that not only is this a very common experience, some studies say 70 to 80% of the population experiences imposter syndrome at some point in their career, but it tends to be more prevalent among high achievers. And so the more you are driven, the more you are pushing the boundaries, the more you are stretching yourself, getting outside your comfort zone, the more likely you are to find yourself in a place where you feel, in over your head, unqualified, like you're just figuring it out and making it up as you go. And even as I talked about those things that I do earlier, that list of, expanding my capacity, I realized that I'm a person that once I get good at something, I get a little bored with it. And so I try something new and I add to it. And I'm always kind of moving to the next thing. And I like to learn. But that means that I'm almost always in unknown territory. I'm almost always trying something that I don't quite feel qualified for, that I don't feel like I am experienced enough or have all the education that I need or something like that. And that's just a trait of a high achiever, is we're always trying to achieve, which means we're always trying to do something new and we're always getting outside of that comfort zone.
I have to imagine, like imposter syndrome, comfort zones are a psychological state that we create from past experiences that we've had as well. And it can feel intangible at times when we speak about imposter syndrome, because I hear you saying it. And the conscious part of my brain that wants to think, no, that's not me all the time. Well, I'm not trying to stop myself from being exposed, starts to happen where I want to think that I don't have those aspects. But in reality, when I do look more deeply into it and I'm willing to hold space to explore what that looks like, I begin to ask myself, based on the story that I want to create and the things that I want to do, am I moving in that direction? Or is there a lot of procrastination that may be happening that can show me maybe I'm not allowing myself to be seen? And on top of the procrastination, am I allowing myself to feel what is emerging from the state of being in imposter syndrome? So it's this fight with my conscious and unconscious brain of where I want to think, maybe it doesn't happen the way I think it happens, but then there is data that shows us. What does that look like for you? And what have you found in your experience that allows us to see, no, this probably is some imposter syndrome happening here?
Yeah. You mentioned procrastination, and one of the things that can tend to come along with imposter syndrome is something that I call productive procrastination. And that is when you are making yourself busy with productive work, but it's really an excuse to avoid really important but scary work. For instance, a new entrepreneur might spend a lot of time fiddling with their website and getting their office set up and organizing their contacts list and, updating their LinkedIn profile and doing things that feel productive. But what they really need to be doing is going and talking to prospective clients. And that's scary because it involves the potential, the high potential, and even the likelihood of failure, of rejection, of disappointment. So we sort of find other stuff to do to keep busy. And this is a trap that many of us, even very successful people, can fall into when, there's that big client proposal that you have the opportunity to present the biggest deal of your life. And there's this subconscious part of you that doesn't want to do it because you're scared of the possibility of failure. And so you just keep finding excuses, reasons to do something else. And so I call that productive procrastination. And it's one of the ways that fear shows up in a subconscious and sort of undermining way that isn't always immediately obvious to us.
How do we avoid falling to the traps of productive procrastination? Because I think another aspect that happens there is we get a lot of those false signals of success. In conversations with others, they may be asking us like, hey, how is this project going? How is the website going? And you're like, well, I just updated it and we have a new link on there where you can book your service. And did you see the new font? It looks so great. I finally put my logo in there.
That's right.
we're then getting rewarded for it in our brains. So how do we work with our brains? How do we hack our subconscious so that we don't fall to the traps of productive procrastination?
I think that we have to regularly stop and assess, sort of step outside of ourselves and look at ourselves and ask, am I working on the most important thing right now? And in fact, as entrepreneurs, one of the things that we can do is to be our own boss. I often tell prospective entrepreneurs, people that are thinking about starting their own businesses, I say, the good news is you get to be your own boss. The bad news is you have to be your own boss.
Yes.
And you might be hard to manage.
Yes.
And so we have to manage ourselves. We have to step outside and look at ourselves, sort of put your business owner hat on and evaluate yourself as the CEO or the manager of the business and say, are you getting the most important stuff done? Are you doing the things that actually push the business forward? Or are you finding ways to look busy and not actually making progress? And so by sort of stepping outside of yourself, by taking off your manager operator hat, putting on your business owner hat and saying, from a business success standpoint, can I trust my manager? Is he or she doing the right set of stuff? Sometimes we can get a different viewpoint on our task list and our calendar and our activities and find out and assess ourselves and course correct of what are the most important things in the long run that we need to be working on right now.
I could tell you that as an entrepreneur and making the jump from a sales leadership executive who had been in the corporate world and loved the structure and the systems and the processes that come with it, that supported my career for a long time, making that transitioning into an entrepreneur was the first time that I really felt the depths and the pain of what I didn't want to experience, because there's that Pinterest versus reality moment. Because I was successful in an environment that allowed me to utilize a lot of skills that, because the systems and processes supported it, doesn't always correlate to coming into a different environment as an entrepreneur with the lack of systems and processes that aren't there in organizations. Not right away, especially when you're a solopreneur. That looks a lot different because you're having to do it all. And so what an organization does support when they have their KPIs, when they have their annual reviews, their mission statements, their values, the continuous check-ins, it helps to give us guidance to what matters more and to measure data as opposed to subjective experiences. And sometimes this entrepreneur journey can feel very subjective, and it's hard to bring out the objectivity. Do you experience that yourself?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, when you're a solopreneur, especially, you don't have a lot of data. You have the experience, the shared experience, and the sort of gut feel, the anecdotal evidence of what you think is working, what you hope is working, what you feels productive. And that's where you can fall into that trap of feeling productive, but not actually moving the needle. And the thing that we have to remember as small businesses, as solopreneurs, is that those big company structures didn't happen overnight. Those big companies took often many years to develop and refine those KPIs and those systems and structures. So we shouldn't feel like, well, I should be able to have all of that in place or create that overnight for myself. That has to be an ongoing process of developing initial versions, creating some structure, giving ourselves some set of metrics, even if it's just 1 or 2 or 3 numbers to work against, and then seeing how that serves us, how that helps us, and refining and building on it over time. But you have to start with something. Otherwise, you really are just operating on gut feel and emotion. And our emotions are so fickle. Our emotions are unreliable. Our emotions can shift based on things like what we ate for breakfast or whether or not we had a good night's sleep or got our exercise in that day. And that's just no way to run a business.
Absolutely. We get to be the observer of those emotions as opposed to making it the final verdict. We get to observe instead. And so in your experience, what have you found is really at the root of what is happening here with imposter syndrome? Where did this all start? Did we all of a sudden one day wake up and say, gosh, I really should be like so-and-so because they sound better and that's why they're successful and that's why I'm not successful? Where did this comparison trap and self-doubt begin?
And so I often tell people that comparing yourself to someone else is like comparing how you look rolling out of bed to how they look walking out their front door. It's you didn't see the process that it took them to get there. You just see the end result. And if you look at yourself in the mirror first thing in the morning, you may not look like that. And you may not feel like you have it all together the way that they do. And so comparing ourselves and especially judging our value against someone else and measuring our progress against someone else is almost never a fair comparison. And so you asked, where did this start? Where did this imposter syndrome happen? I think that it has grown in concert with, or in connection, it correlates to our ability to compare ourselves to people. If you go back 100 years or even 60, 70 years ago, the circle of people that you had access to that you could see and compare yourself with was fairly limited. And as especially social media and the connectivity of the internet, as great as it is, and I'm a technology guy, I'm a former software developer, I've done a lot with technology, but as these things have connected us with so many people all around the world, and we have so many very superficial relationships, I think that comparison trap has been amplified because we can see the highlight reel of everyone's life. We can see the filtered and polished, Instagram version of someone's career, and then judge ourselves and our progress and our success against what we're seeing there. And that's why this problem of the comparison trap and how it leads to imposter syndrome and feeling inadequate has only amplified and intensified over the last couple of decades.
Do you experience the same in your journey throughout the chapters of your life?
Absolutely. And so, I originally started researching imposter syndrome for me. When I learned about it, it was like a huge relief just to hear that this was a thing, that other people experienced it, that I wasn't alone in those feelings of worrying that I was inadequate. And so it was a great relief to know that it was a thing, but I really wanted to understand it. I wanted to understand the psychological mind game and the traps that I was going to fall into and how to counteract those things. And so I started studying this phenomenon for myself initially, and then started helping my clients and my fellow entrepreneurs, my colleagues, started talking with other people about what I was learning. And the response that I got told me that this was a pervasive problem, that it was widespread, that there were lots of people struggling, and that many of them were struggling in silence because they thought they were the only ones. And so I felt compelled eventually to write this book, Overcoming the Imposter, about this topic. But I'll tell you that I learned so many things about myself in the process of writing the book and examining my story and looking back at my own history of wrestling with self-doubt. And even in the process of writing this book, I struggled with imposter syndrome. Am I worthy to write a book about this topic? Am I really an expert just because I've experienced this and I've read about it and I've read all the studies and talked to people? And then I felt like, well, if I'm struggling with imposter syndrome, then do I have the right to write a book about imposter syndrome? Because clearly I haven't mastered it myself. And what I learned was that imposter syndrome is not something you overcome one time, that you beat it and eradicate it from your life. That those feelings of self-doubt have a tendency to creep back up on you anytime you try something new. So this is the first book I've ever written. I will probably write more in my career, but this being the first one, I really wrestled with, can I write a good book? Can I write a book good enough that I would want my name on the cover? And so I had to process that, and I had to wrestle through those doubts. And I ended up using some of the very tactics and techniques that I describe in this book on myself during the process of writing and publishing and eventually promoting a book. That promotion process, telling people about this thing that I've written, it is fraught with feelings of inadequacy and self-doubt because I don't like being self-promotional. Come to really believe, because of the evidence, the stories that I've heard, and the now thousands of people that have told me what an impact this book has had, I've really come to believe that this is a valuable work, and I no longer feel like I'm inadequate to promote and say, this is a great book and it will help you. But the next time I try something new, I know that's going to happen again. I know that those thoughts are going to creep up and I'm going to feel like, man, okay, I've got the speaker and the author and the coach thing down, but can I do this? I don't know. That's a struggle. And so I have to use these strategies again and again to overcome self-doubt every time it comes. And that's why the book is called Overcoming It's an ongoing process of overcoming the imposter every time it shows up in my life.
Oh, absolutely. And it makes so much sense because as our stories evolve, our environment changes. The strategies that you use in order for you to grow when you were 18 and developing and asserting who you are in your career are completely different than what you use today because your environment is different. And so as our environment changes, we have to look into our stories and how they've evolved in order for us to say, okay, what is the different strategy that I have to use here? Because while you may have values and you may have skills that build upon each other, you are meeting new people and new experiences continuously that challenge how you show up, how you feel, and how you behave. And it's a great calling into being able to create that story that you want. And for you, you saw it as that signal to dive deeper so that you can have the thing that you want, which is to be able to expound your knowledge here and to share this information with others. I'm curious, in your book, just in your experience in general, what are the more nuanced ways that imposter syndrome shows up? How can we diagnose it? I imagine it on a spectrum, right? Where most of us can speak to it on the extremes that we can imagine showing up. As speakers, we continuously have to get on stage. And the extreme side of it would be just saying, no, I'm not going to speak today. I don't feel right, and avoiding it. And most people can conceptualize that context. But what are some of the ways where it's a little bit more turned down that we can tune into to help diagnose, okay, I am in that psychological state?
Yeah. Well, one of the really common symptoms of imposter syndrome is the inability to accept a compliment at face value. So you've probably experienced this. Someone tells you, Shiley, I love your podcast. I love the work that you do. And the temptation, and so often the response is to downplay that or to deflect it with sarcasm. I know I struggle with sarcasm. Say, oh, it's not a big deal. Or, we deflect that compliment rather than receiving it. And I had this realization when I was working on actually a speech that preceded this book, when I was developing some of these ideas and looking for the signs of imposter syndrome. And I realized that when somebody compliments you and you downplay or deflect that compliment, you're actually insulting that person. You're telling them that they don't know what they're talking about, or their opinion isn't valid, or that you just don't care about their opinion. They've handed you a gift and you've looked at the gift and said, nah, don't want it. And so one of the things that I challenge the readers to do in this book is to curb that behavior, to recognize when someone hands you a compliment, don't insult them by throwing that compliment away, that you receive it and internalize it and express your gratitude for it. So I tell people, when someone compliments your work, look them in the eye and say, thank you. I worked really, really hard on that. And I'm so glad to know that work is appreciated.
What do you think is arising in our minds that makes it difficult to not accept it? What are we experiencing inside of there?
I think there's a couple of things. In some people, it's an attempt to appear humble, or even an attempt to genuinely be humble. Like we think, oh, we can't just say, yes, of course it was awesome. I did a great job. Right? We don't want to be patting ourselves on the back. But what I've recognized is that attempting to appear humble is a form of managing your image that is wearing a mask. It's a sort of a form of pride that is still artificial and false. If you're wanting to look humble and you're concerned with appearing humble, then that's not being authentic. And so the authentic thing to do is just to say, wow, I'm so glad that what I did resonated with you. I'm so glad that what I did, you found valuable and helpful. And so whether it's a desire to appear humble, of trying to play a part that we think people want us to play, or it's just a response to a fear that they don't really know the whole story. They only see the good that happened, but they don't know that I struggled my way through that, or they don't know that I really didn't feel like I knew what I was doing, that I just I just made that up. I just figured that out. And so that praise isn't really warranted. That praise isn't really deserved because it's only based on that sort of half truth and that outward filtered version where I know inside I struggled and I wrestled and I didn't feel like that actually went very well. And so it's usually one of those two things I think that's happening in our mind. But in either case, acting in that way, deflecting like that doesn't build our confidence. It doesn't help us to lean into the things that we're good at. And so I really encourage my readers and listeners to just accept that compliment and internalize it and let it build your confidence, let it build your strength, and let it help you to quiet that voice of that inner critic. It's evidence that inner critic is wrong. And so you should accept that and receive it and be grateful for it.
Absolutely. The human experience is dynamic, of course. There's a lot of different variabilities that go into that. But what it does show us is that we can hold space with someone else who is acknowledging an aspect of our work. As long as those comments are sincere and genuine and it aligns in the direction that we want to go, it's a perfect opportunity for us to have self-awareness and notice, simply know what do we notice when we get compliments.
Yeah.
And then to also understand, where do we go from here? So how do I make sure that I reduce that impact? Because as you said, overcoming it's going to be a lifelong journey as we are always reaching for new heights and what we want to experience and what we want to explore. We are going to always have this rumbling inside of us, but we don't have to have the negative impacts that come with it. What are the variables that we can quantify and measure to hold objectively along with us to say, okay, I did do this. I am doing that. I'm on the right path. Let me continue to expound on that.
Yeah, there's a series of habits that I lay out in the book, and I'll just touch on a couple of them because there's 10 in the book as a whole. But one of them, the one big one, is about how you view failure. And it's the habit of reframing failure as learning. So if you see failure as a black mark on your record, if you see failure as a negative score, a mark against you, something that's going to follow you and plague you and hold you back, well, then you're going to be really risk averse. And you're going to only try things when you're almost absolutely certain that success is inevitable. And so you're going to be really, really careful. And that voice of that inner critic is going to talk you out of most things when there's opportunity. But if you can change the way you view failure and recognize that we learn more from failure than we do from success, and that in fact, most successes are built on a series of failures and learnings. And so failure and success are not opposites. They're actually much more connected and intertwined than we realize. And so when I attempt something new, I have this mantra that I've developed that when I try something new, I have only one of two options, one of two outcomes that are possible. I'm either going to succeed or I'm going to learn. Those are the only two choices. And as long as I learn something from the quote failure, if it doesn't go the way I want it to, then it's still a net positive. It's still a step in the right direction. And those accumulated learnings, aka failures, are going to be what eventually leads to success. And so when you adopt that mindset, and I go much deeper, of course, in the book on that, when you really get into that kind of a mindset, you're much more likely to take a risk. You're a lot more willing to try things and to push through that fear, that insecurity, rather than to let it hold you back.
It sounds like there's a foundation here of growth mindset versus fixed mindset.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Carol Dweck and her book Mindset, and I cite her in the bibliography of the book and have built on some of those very concepts.
What was your last failure? And give me the spectrum. Take me through an experience where before you were able to actively practice a lot of these strategies consciously, right? Because a lot of times we got to bring it out of the subconscious first to even recognize what do we need to be aware of? How do we attune to that? How do we create constructive measures that help us move forward? But tell me on one end, when you experienced a failure where you had the destruction of it all come forward, and then what it looks like for you today.
Yeah, boy. A number of years ago, I was running an IT consulting firm that I had built to 7 figures in revenue. And over a period of about a year, I had more than half of my staff hired away from me by clients with deep pockets.
Yeah.
And they, in many cases, paid the penalties and fees that were in the contract. But I had some really, really good people and some clients enticed them away with great opportunities. And I was excited and grateful for the opportunity that each person was given, but it devastated my company. And I felt like that was a failure. I felt in the moment like I had failed as an entrepreneur. And in fact, I remember someone introducing me as a successful entrepreneur, and I wanted to crawl in a corner and say, don't call me that, because I had this successful company that was growing and growing and growing for years. And then it had this big step back all at once. And it took me a good year or so to even figure out how I wanted to respond, what I wanted to do. It created a lot of fear in me. Like maybe, again, all of my success up to that point was just a happy accident. And now this was the proof that I didn't know what I was doing as an entrepreneur. And so that was a dark period in my entrepreneurial journey and a difficult time for me to wrestle with and challenge through some things. But then you contrast that. I'm trying to think of a more recent example. I have, I've attempted some things, put on some events or tried some things with my business that just sort of flopped. And instead of beating myself up or looking at that as a step backwards, as I mentioned, I've been able to just ask myself, well, okay, what did you learn from that? And how can you apply that learning to either the next attempt to do that thing again, or if I decide that thing is not worth doing, how do I apply that learning to the next project or the next initiative that I'm going to take on? And so now I'm a lot more willing to experiment and even endure a public failure and not worry so much about what people think and be focused a lot more on what am I learning in the process and how is that propelling me forward?
It sounds like you were able to break that rumination loop, dismantle it because you became aware of it, and then to harness it for growth.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the growth is so valuable. And that has led to, going back to our earlier conversation of the layering and the growing my capacity and the things that I've been able to add and build in my business have come from just being willing to try something and see it not go so well. And yet to just draw from that, to leave the negative emotions behind, sort of eat the hay and leave the sticks, as the old saying goes, and leave the negative emotions behind, get all the good learning out of it, and then just keep moving forward.
I think that's a perfect transition as we wrap up the show. I'm curious to hear, we always love to have our guests leave our audience with a challenge. Based on our conversation today, what would you challenge our audience to do?
Well, the one challenge that I've already given, I'll reiterate, is when someone pays you a compliment, it's one of the hardest things to do, but at least for me it is. Maybe some of your listeners and viewers are having a lot easier than this, but to just simply say thank you, to be really grateful and to honor the giver of that gift. Give them as much honor as they've given you, as they've shown you with that compliment. And then soak that in and let that build and let that grow. And then the second challenge we've also touched on a little bit is to the next time you're going to try something where the risk of failure is high, the chances of success are certainly not certain and maybe even below 50%. It's maybe unlikely that it's going to succeed, but ask yourself, what could I learn if I try this? And what are those possibilities that are there beyond just the one outcome of ultimate success? What other positive outcomes could there be? And let that fuel you and give you the confidence to step out and take a risk, try something and learn, and then apply that learning to the next thing you try.
Absolutely. And it can be a devastating destruction if we do not have a relationship with imposter syndrome, welcome it and understand it. Because as we are on this adventure to experience life and how it feels authentic to our story so that we can make our 80-year-old selves proud, our 109-year-old selves proud,
Yes.
we really have to attune to the relationship and get intimate with what it looks like so that it's not a destruction in our life and that we can use it as an opportunity to reduce that learning curve for future growth-based experiences that will inevitably come as we continue to expound. So Chris, how can our audience get in contact with you? Can you tell us more about your work and also how they can get in contact with you?
Yeah, I'm easy to find online. If you remember that my name starts with a K, K-R-I-S, Kelso, K-E-L-S-O. I'm at chriskelso.com, and I'm Chris Kelso on most of the major social platforms. And then specifically, you can find out about this book, Overcoming the Imposter, at overcomingtheimposter.com. And there's a couple of resources there I want to point out. Number one is you can get a free sample chapter, and it is the chapter all about reframing failure as learning. And I've got a great metaphor, powerful metaphor in that chapter that is really valuable. So the chapter is standalone. It doesn't just set up the problem and not give you any solutions. It's a great chapter that is useful on its own, but it'll give you a sampling of the book as a whole. And then the other thing I want to mention at that same site, overcomingtheimposter.com, there's a new online course that I've just spent about 9 months developing. And you want to talk about some, success through failure. That was a lot of work and some tough lessons and setbacks along the way. But I have built a course that goes much deeper than the book into figuring out where your self-doubt comes from and what those struggles are all about and how you can identify the unique aspects of your story that give you strength and turn those into a net positive and leverage those experiences to build your confidence. And so that course was just released and it's available at overcomingtheimposter.com. I'm really excited about the impact that that's going to have.
Chris, we are so excited that you were able to share some space with us. I thank you for joining us in this space where we can contain the ideas, the feelings, and the behaviors that help us deepen our relationship, having imposter syndrome, and recognizing that at its truest core, it is a call for us to continue to expound in the areas that will serve our growth if we're willing to create that constructive strategies around it that help us connect with our stories.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun having this conversation. I've enjoyed it a lot.
To our listeners, the ball is in your court. I challenge you to take action. Continue to dive deeper into the experiences that call you into alignment with your authentic story. We appreciate you for holding this space with us, and we are excited to hear where Chapter 4 takes you after the release of this course.
Thank you.
If you found even the smallest nugget of wisdom in this episode, share it with a friend and your friend will thank you. Let's continue the conversation with like-minded leaders and join us on Facebook at Go Flip the Script. Until next time, I challenge you to incorporate what you learned today to evolve your leadership impact.